started making names right away. And I loved it. I was robbing drug dealers and taking their gold right off their neck. And the shit we did, who's going to call the police on you? A drug dealer?
I can identify with anything that was normal, to be honest with you. But I was born and raised in Brooklyn, New York. Yeah.
99% of the time, you're going to disagree.
Just like the Donnie Brasco situation with Lefty.
Yeah, because the reason why, they figure it this way. You brought this guy around, he ratted on everybody, now he ratted on you. You might turn around and join him and rat on us, so we get rid of you, there's no connection between there and there, and they get rid of you.
Hi, I'm Jeffery Sussman, and I'm chatting with Staxx.
Welcome to this episode of Chatting with Staxx. I'm your host, Bill Staxx, and today I got Jeffery Sussman. They pleaded guilty to these charges that were brought against them. That's them admitting that they are part of a crime family.
Right. It is.
And people are telling me, no, that's not. Yeah, it is. Like, what are you talking about?
Some of these people try to cut a very fine line. They'll admit to committing a crime, but at the same time, they'll deny that they're part of an organization. And the reason they denied that they're part of an organization is so that you can't hit them with a RICO statute. But if you admit to, extortion or usury or whatever, loan sharking, that's a crime in and of itself, and you could do time for it. But then on the other hand, if in addition to that you admit that you're part of an organization, that's a conspiracy to commit crime, and then bam, you're going to be hit with a RICO statute.
You stayed in New York, but you got interested in the whole Las Vegas scheme, right?
Right, and I did primarily because of these three men that I met. Just sparked my interest, and I had always been interested in organized crime. And after writing the book about New York, I thought, what's a better place to look at it again than Las Vegas? I mean, it was an open city, so any mobster could come in there and start operating. Jimmy Hoffa, through the Central States Pension Fund, gave loans to all these gangsters who wanted to open casinos there. He and Mo Dalitz had been friends back in Detroit. Mo Dalitz's family owned some laundries, and there was an attempt to unionize them. And Dalitz went to Hoffa and said, "Can you help me so that the union doesn't come into my father's stores?" And Hoffa did. And from that point on, Hoffa and Dalitz were good friends. So when Dalitz wanted to open the Desert Inn, he went to Jimmy Hoffa, and Jimmy Hoffa made sure that he got all the money that he needed to open the Desert Inn.
That was a risky job to take money from them back then.
And he paid it all back.
So what happened with the Bugsy Siegel situation? A lot of people are like, they have misinformation about that. They don't really know what happened. Do you have any insight on that situation?
Yeah. Initially, when Dewey was cracking down on the mob in New York City, Frank Costello moved his slot machines to New Orleans. Meyer Lansky opened gambling casinos in Hallandale and Hollywood, Florida. And Bugsy Siegel came out to California to take over the racing wire that bookies needed. And he knew about Vegas because he and his partners, Meyer Lansky and Frank Costello and Luciano, even though Luciano was in Italy at this time, they owned pieces of these sort of like cowboy saloons, that had a roulette wheel and some card tables and so forth, and sawdust on the floor. And then there was a guy from California named Billy Wilkerson, who owned the Hollywood Reporter and a couple of fancy restaurants in Beverly Hills. And he started building the Flamingo. The Flamingo was his idea, and he came up with the name Flamingo, not Bugsy Siegel. And he ran out of money. And the banks wouldn't lend him any money because the banks wouldn't lend money to casinos in those days. They thought it was too risky. So he went to the mob to borrow money, and they gave him the money. And then they they took, I think, like 80% of. They formed a corporation and with stockholders, and the mob took 80%, and they gave Wilkerson 20%. But then the mob decided that they wanted 100%, and Bugsy Siegel said to Wilkerson, "You better sell me your shares, or I'm going to kill you." And Wilkerson originally didn't want to, and then the threats became so intense that Wilkerson sold his shares to Bugsy Siegel, but he was still so frightened that he went and lived in France for a year to avoid being killed. But Bugsy Siegel was a little bit of a kleptomaniac, because even though the mob now gave him $1 million to finish building the Flamingo, he kept jacking up the price because he and his girlfriend, Virginia Hill, was skimming money from the mob themselves.
And what were they buying with the money? What were they doing with the money?
They were sending it to Swiss banks. They weren't buying anything with it. It was just incredible. They were just greedy, and eventually, the mob said to Siegel, "You either have to pay it back or else." And he didn't believe they would do anything, because he had been friends with these guys since he was a teenager, and he knew them very well, and so he never thought that they would. They would kill
when they
him.
asked him to pay it, what was his response?
He kind of put them off. He said, I'll pay you eventually. He said, "Don't worry, this place will open. We'll make a lot of money, and you won't be worried." But when he opened, the opening was a failure, and they actually lost money. The only gambler who lost money that night, and that was sort of as a favor to Bugsy Siegel, was the actor George Raft, who intentionally lost $60,000 as a favor to Bugsy Siegel. But that was nothing compared to the amount of money that.
And then they had a reopening of it.
Right.
That was a success, the reopening. Right. But by that time, it was too late for him, right?
It was too late. And there's been a lot of talk about who is it who killed Bugsy Siegel. When Bugsy was part of Murder Incorporated, before he worked with a guy named Frankie Carbo, who took over the boxing industry pretty much in the 20th century. He ran boxing, he and a guy named Blinky Palermo. And
wasn't he related to the woman that was killed by the Jinx?
I don't know. That's a good question.
You know the murder Jinx? The Jinx?
Yeah.
He killed Susan Berman's father. Was
yeah, you're right. And Susan Berman was killed by that real estate heir, Robert Durst.
Yes, Susan Berman's father was related somehow to.
Well, no, he owned points in a lot of the casinos. He was a gangster. Susan Berman wrote a book about him. Okay, so I'll get to that in a second, because that's an interesting story that I have to tell you. But the guy who was head of the Philadelphia mob at one time, Ralph. I can't think of his last name. Natali, very good. He said that everyone in the mob knew that Frankie Carbo was the trigger man who killed Bugsy Siegel, and they chose him because he was the one who could get closest to Bugsy if there was a problem.
Didn't he shoot him with a sniper rifle?
Yeah. He shot him in the back of the head with a carbine. So then, Virginia Hill was in Europe at the time. She wasn't, as in the movie, she wasn't there when it happened. But Meyer Lansky hunted her down and said, "We know how much money you stole, and you better pay it back." And she did pay it back, but eventually she committed suicide. And she was, she had tried to commit suicide about 4 or 5 times before that.
Do you think she really committed?
It's anyone's guess, but she had a history of it. That's all I can say. She had a history of it.
Unaliving herself, I'll have to re-edit that in, because they don't like when you say that word.
Right.
Yeah, YouTube's a little sensitive these days.
So what I heard from one of the people I interviewed about Susan Berman was that her father, like Siegel and Virginia Hill, had squirreled a lot of money away in a Swiss bank account. And whenever she needed money, she would go to Switzerland about twice a year, and she would bring back cash to the United States.
Then she got involved with the wrong guy.
She sure did. I mean, that guy was really crazy. I mean, there was Robert Durst was nuts.
Yeah, he was. So, what do you think about these barrels that they're finding in Las Vegas? Do you think it has anything to do with the back in the day when they were killing people, putting them in barrels?
You mean the things in the Mead Lake?
Yeah, like
Yeah,
me.
it's possible. Though, you know, Susan Dalitz, who I interviewed extensively, Mo Dalitz's daughter, she told me that when she was growing up, there was no place safer than Las Vegas. No one locked their doors. You know, she was 13 years old. She could go out on the street at 1 o'clock in the morning and no one would ever bother her. And to show you how free it was, when she was a kid, she could wander in and out of the count rooms at the casinos. And
Where they got the money, and you're like, just
now nobody can go in the count.
Mind blowing. It
It's
really
just
is.
extraordinary.
Is she still around?
Oh yeah, Susan is around. She lives in Las Vegas. She's a really nice woman. She's married. She has kids, and it was funny because I had a friend, a lawyer here in New York, who, when he graduated from law school, went to work with that infamous lawyer Roy Cohn, who handled a lot of mob cases. So I was telling Susan that my friend told me that Roy Cohn handled her mother's divorce from Mo Dalitz, and she's sitting there in Roy's office, and Roy says to her, "Don't worry about Mo Dalitz. He's nothing but a punk." And Mrs. Dalitz says to Roy, she says, "Believe me, you can say a lot of things about Mo, but he's certainly no punk. I'll tell you that." And it's an example of this to show how powerful he was. When the mob sent the outfit sent Jimmy Roselli to Las Vegas to look after the skim in a lot of places. And he was a hot shot, and he thought he could exert himself and take over a lot of things. And he was having lunch one day with Mo Dalitz and another man. And Mo Dalitz arranged for this to happen. A deputy sheriff came in and said to Jimmy Roselli, he said, "Can you step outside? I'd like to talk to you." And Roselli, being a hothead, told the deputy to get lost and cursed at him. Deputy left. 10 minutes later, the sheriff comes in and grabs Jimmy Roselli by the collar and hoists him away and threw him in jail for 24 hours. And Mo Dalitz and his friend just didn't say anything. They just went on eating. But what I found out is this was Mo Dalitz's way of saying, "You're not such a hotshot. Don't try to, mess with me, and don't try to move in on me."
Yeah, like they have influence there because they were involved with the politics too, right? They had politicians, everything, police, everybody's involved with them.
Mo Dalitz had Senator McCarran, who was the big senator from Nevada, on his payroll. He paid for all of his campaigns. And Mo Dalitz became so powerful that he was invited to the presidential inaugurations of Ronald Reagan and Richard Nixon and many of the big politicians in those days. I mean, his power was just extraordinary.
That's wild. So did you cover the later Las Vegas too, around the Spilotros and all that?
Oh yeah. I have a chapter in my book about Lefty Rosenthal, Tony Spilotro, and the guy who they called the genius, who they put in as the front man to run the four casinos for them. And Gary Jenkins. Because Gary gave me a lot of information since he was involved in helping the FBI wiretap those guys, especially Nick Savella in Kansas City. So I got a lot of information from Gary for my chapter on Lefty Rosenthal and Tony Spilotro. What was interesting is that I also later found out that Lefty Rosenthal was a high echelon informant for the FBI. And that's why they tried to kill him. Because Nick Savella and Balistrieri, the mob boss of Milwaukee, suspected him, and those suspicions grew into a very strong belief, and they decided he was going to be killed, and that's why the bomb was placed in his car. And if Lefty's wife hadn't died of a drug overdose, they were going to kill her as well because she was also an FBI informant.
Wow.
The two of them were,
And
because
they figure all this out. They figured it out.
yeah, they did. And Lefty's reason for it was, he was a gambler. He says, I want to protect myself on the low end and I want to protect myself on the high end. So I'm not going to get arrested if I continue working with the FBI, and if I continue working with the mob, I'm going to make a fortune over here.
It's crazy. I have a video of Nancy Spilotro talking to Michael's wife, talking about the last day they saw their husbands.
Wow, that's an interesting one.
Yeah, I haven't released it yet, but I have it.
Oh, you should.
Yeah, it's a really good one, man. It's
I'll
both
bet.
of them talking on the phone to each other. I got a video of her doing it. And,
Wow.
yeah,
Who made
it's
the
crazy.
video? Do you know? Do you know who made the video?
Michael's son, Michael.
Oh, really?
Yeah,
Michael's son. Wow.
Michael
amazing.
Spilatro's son. Yeah, I
Yeah,
talked to him quite a bit.
The other thing I learned is that not as it happened in the movie Casino, but they took Tony accompanied his brother Michael to a place in Chicago because he thought his brother was going to be inducted and be made a member of the outfit, and then they beat them to death, not with baseball bats, but with their fists and their shoes. And
There's
then
rumors that the bosses were there.
yeah, that's possible. It may have been the bosses were furious because they blamed the fact that all the head of the outfit and the subsidiary outfits in Kansas City, Milwaukee, Detroit, Cleveland, all those guys got indicted and all of them went to prison, and they blamed it all on Tony Spilotro, that he brought all of this down on them, and they hated him, and they made an example of him and killed him. They dumped him in a car and then they drove him to a cornfield in Indiana.
Him and his brother.
His brother, right? And then when an autopsy was done, they said even though these guys were beaten, they weren't dead when they were buried. They died of asphyxiation. They were suffocated when the dirt came down.
With the dirt, yeah. Wow,
Yeah.
that's pretty brutal.
It was
for them to go through that extreme.
Yeah, just goes to show how much they were hated.
Matter of fact, Nick Calabrese was involved with that murder, and he just passed away at the age of 80 years old.
God bless him.
Yeah, I've interviewed Frank. I've talked to quite a few people involved with the Spilotros, and I've been to Spilotro's house. I went by the restaurant. I took tours around Chicago. I like to go to places that I talk about.
But, as I mentioned earlier, my father was an amateur boxer. And when I was a kid growing up, I was a skinny little kid. And my father was worried that bigger kids would pick on me. So he gave me boxing lessons. And then there used to be a famous gym in New York called Stillman's Gym. And I was about, 13 or 14 years old. And my father signed me up for 10 boxing lessons there. And I got to see a lot of famous professional boxers train there, like Rocky Graziano, who became a hero of mine. And I wrote his biography, by the way.
You did?
Yeah, Rocky Graziano.
What was he like to meet him?
He was an interesting guy. He was kind of like a D's, Dems, and Does kind of guy, but he was funny. He was affectionate. He had a terrific sense of humor. He would say, when I was a kid, I stole everything that began with an A: a bicycle, a television, a car, a radio.
That's a great one.
And he was like a natural comedian. And, after he won, I didn't know him, because he was much older than I, but from people I interviewed, they said that after he won the middleweight boxing champion, he became the nicest guy. It was like all the anger drained out of him that had caused him to initially become a boxer. And so he would hang out at Stillman's Gym. And one day he saw an old boxer who was sitting off in the corner. The guy had gone blind and he was living in a welfare hotel. He had no money. And Rocky went around to everyone in the arena and made them give a donation for this guy. And Rocky gave money. And he went up to the guy and he put it in the breast pocket of his sports jacket. And he said, I want you to know you're going to get this every month. You just make sure you're here every month and you're going to get this.
Wow. That's crazy, man. And Willie Pep, they were close, weren't they? Willie Pep and Rocky Marciano.
Well, Rocky Graziano's closest friend was Jake LaMotta. They had been in reform school together. And what was funny about this is that when Rocky was a kid, he was a juvenile delinquent, and he was getting into fights on the street. He had a wild temper that he couldn't control. He would just blow up. So one day he says to Jake LaMotta while they're in reform school, he says, Jake, if you're ever going to be successful as a boxer, you better learn to control your temper. And here's this guy who can't control his own temper, who is helping people left and right.
It is all about controlling your temper. I've been studying boxing and practicing and taking lessons. It's never too late, right?
No, never. And my father had a very close friend growing up. His name was Abe Simon. He was a heavyweight boxer. He boxed Joe Louis twice for the heavyweight title. He lost both times. I think it was in 1941 and 1942. And I met him. He was really a very, very nice guy. But he had if you ever go up to the boxing museum or the Boxing Hall of Fame in Canastota, New York, they have a mold of his fist. And it's the biggest fist that I've ever seen. It's like the size of a computer keypad.
It's like that big, right?
Enormous.
What the hell?
And he got a shot at the heavyweight title because he had knocked out a boxer named Jersey Joe Walcott, who was a big upcoming boxer at the time. But then he went on to have a career in the movies. You've seen the movie On the Waterfront with Marlon Brando.
Probably.
Yeah. It takes place on the docks in New York, and how an illegal union is running the dock workers. Anyway, he plays one of the thugs in that movie, and then he was in another one I think called Requiem for a Heavyweight, and he made about 5 movies, and then he suffered from terrible arthritis late in life, and he just was sort of housebound after a while. But a wonderful guy. And my father told me, these great stories about him growing up.
I've had Jacko Holleran on my show recently.
Oh, really?
Yeah, he's a professional boxer. Do you know who he is?
No, I don't.
So Jack Holleran was in Superman 1, 2. He was in Dragnet. He's the son of Albert Anastasia.
Really?
Yeah.
And he doesn't use the name Anastasia, huh?
No. His Albert had another family.
Yeah.
And that's where he came from.
Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah, very.
Yeah.
But he got the manifesto from his father right after he died from his mom.
Wow. Interesting.
I'll show you a picture of him.
Yeah, I'd like to see a picture of him.
You see him in the background?
Oh, yeah. I've seen his face on the screen. I didn't make a connection. I didn't know that he was a boxer.
Yeah, Jack Holleran. He's a professional boxer, heavyweight champion of California. He's a pretty big deal.
Yeah, he must be.
He's been in Dragnet, King Kong. Here's his picture right here. Right here.
Oh, yeah.
You know him?
Absolutely, yeah.
That's him boxing right there. See him boxing right up here?
Yeah, right. Wow.
Heavyweight champion, man.
Amazing.
Of the world.
You know who I wrote about and I interviewed his son a lot was Max Baer, who became the heavyweight champion in 1935. And his son was Max Baer Jr., who was on the TV show The Beverly Hillbillies. Do you remember that show?
Yes, yeah, I do.
He was the very tall guy.
Yeah.
So I'll tell you a quick funny story that he told me. When he was in college, he thought that he might like to become a boxer like his father. And they were living in Sacramento, California. And his father said, we'll go into the backyard and I'll teach you how to box. And we'll put on these big, heavy gloves. They're like pillows. We're not going to hurt each other. And he said, but just remember one thing. Don't hit me in the face, and I won't hit you in the face, but I'll teach you, how to jab, how to slip a punch, how to block, and so forth. And so they're doing this for a while. And all of a sudden, Max Baer Jr. hauls off and punches his father in the face. And the next thing he knows, he's looking up at the sky. And his mother is hanging out of the second-story bedroom window, and she's yelling at her husband, saying, what did you do? What did you do? You killed our son. And Max Baer Jr. said, I had no idea what happened. My father's reaction, as soon as I hit him in the face, was to hit me with a right, and I went out in a second. And Jack Dempsey, who trained Max Baer for some of his fights, said that Max Baer had the hardest right fist of any fighter he had ever seen. With one punch, he could just destroy you.
And that's your dad hitting you.
Yeah.
No,
and then you
thanks,
could throw
man.
a punch at him.
Wow. Well, Dan, there's a lot we can go over. I'm sure I can have you on for hours and hours and not get tired of it. But do you want to tell the people where they can find your book?
Yeah, you can find Sin City Gangsters, The Rise and Decline of the Mob in Las Vegas on Amazon.com, BarnesNoble.com, or any other online bookseller.
Definitely. I appreciate you taking the time.
Well, this has been wonderful. I really enjoyed the conversation.
Definitely. If you like this type of content, make sure you hit the like, subscribe, and notification bell so you could get my videos every time they drop. And make sure you check out his book. Till next time. Thanks, man.
Thank you.